Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Wait is Over, the final CMMC rule explained, presented by NeoSystems, FutureFeed, and Holland Knight. I'm Don Carnevale, Marketing Director at NeoSystems, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them into the Q&A area within Zoom. We will have some time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. For any questions we are not able to answer today, we will have our speakers review them and provide answers that we will share with you in the coming days. Now I'd like to introduce the host for today's discussion, Stuart Itkin from NeoSystems. Stuart?
Hey, Don, thank you. And I'd like to emphasize again that today's discussion is brought to you jointly by NeoSystems, FutureFeed, and by Holland and Knight. And before we get started, I have a quick word from our attorneys to share with you. So this webinar is being provided as a public service. The content is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended, nor does it constitute legal or business advice. By providing this information, we are not acting as your lawyer. There are many subtleties to these topics that cannot be comprehensively addressed in a webinar. You're strongly encouraged to contact a competent attorney before taking any action. All content and opinions are strictly those of the presenter and are not representative of any presenter's employers, affiliated entities, clients, or their associates. So that said, if you're with us today, then you're aware that the CMMC final rule was published this week in the Federal Register. And if you've downloaded it, you know it doesn't read like a Jack Reacher novel. It's long. It's about as long as Homer's The Odyssey. It's full of internal references, external references, and acronyms. And our objective today is to really distill the key principles of the rule, explain them in simpler terms, and explain what they mean to you. So we've got a lot of ground that we want to cover. We're going to explain why the CMMC program was created and how we got to where we are. And as I mentioned, the rule's not easy to read. We'll provide some advice on how to read through it, how you can understand it a little bit better. We'll explain what else needs to happen before CMMC requirements can be placed into contracts. And then we'll get into some of the specifics, explaining the program's basic structure, the timeline for its rollout, what is in scope, the role of external providers, service providers, and we'll touch on what an assessment may cost you. And finally, as Don said, we'll address questions at the end. And if we don't get to all questions, we'll post the questions and answers and send them to everyone in attendance in a link. Well, my name is Stuart Itkin. I'm a Senior Vice President with NeoSystems. And joining me today are Jim Goepel, General Counsel and Director of Education for FutureFeed, and Eric Crusius, a partner with the law firm of Holland & Knight. And so, Eric, can you kick us off? I mean, CMMC version 1.0 was published in January 2020. And, looking at my watch, it's about 2024. How did we get to where we are today? And just why has it taken so long?
I think we could spend the whole hour talking about that, but we won't do that. We'll just spend about 5 minutes. The interesting thing is where we are now, which will help with how we got here, is that there is, this has been a problem or an issue that's been brewing with the Department of Defense for a long time. But today we know what the requirements will be. We know what the rule is going to say. Before this final rule came out, we could make educated guesses. We could give advice off of those educated guesses, which I think were largely correct. But all these things that you're seeing on this slide is what led up to the release that happened earlier this week. So it started before this, but we're not going to go back to the dinosaurs. But it started kind of relevant to us with the DoD release of DFARS 252-204-7012, which happened about 7 years ago. And that initially required contractors to assess themselves off of a subset of NIST 853, and then at some point it changed to NIST 800-171. And since that time, DoD has required contractors that have had controlled and classified information to be compliant with the 110 controls in NIST 800-171. Now, there are a subset of contractors also that don't have controlled and classified information that have a lower level of requirements consistent with the 15 controls in FAR 52-204-21. But for our purposes, for CMMC, we're going to look at DFARS 252-204-7012. We've heard for a long time that from folks within DoD that they didn't think that contractors were paying attention to this requirement and that they weren't compliant with the controls that are in NIST 800-171, even though this was a DFARS requirement in these contracts when contractors had controlled unclassified information. So think of the 7012 clause as the first step. Then the second step was this 7020 clause and the appendant 7019 clause. And that required contractors to go into the supplier performance risk system and say, how many of these 110 controls are you actually compliant with? And kind of essentially confess how many of the controls, whether it's 110 or something less, that contractors are compliant with. And this is a requirement that started showing up in contracts a few years ago. And that was kind of step two. Now DoD has visibility into how many of the controls contractors are generally compliant with. And the vast majority of contractors, it was a score less than 110, which DoD has long suspected that it was a number less than 110. And here we are today where, you know, most of the time a contractor inputs something into the supplier performance risk system and it's not a perfect score. So now DoD is taking this third step, right? We've started with these kind of the self-assessment that was just in the contract. Now it's a self-assessment where you actually tell DoD actively how many controls you're compliant with. And now this third step is we're going to require a third-party certification because this is too important for this controlled unclassified information. Compliance with these controls is too important. So now, you know, you've had 7 years or so to kind of get up to speed on these controls. We're going to have a third party come in and verify compliance with those controls. And for those companies that have controlled unclassified information as part of their performance of the contract, we now have CMMC, which is going to require a third-party certification in order to do business with the Department of Defense as a prime contractor or in the supply chain.
So Jim, can you talk a little bit about how somebody can distill the information that is in the final rule document?
Sure. So as it says on the screen, and as you said, Stuart, this is not a short document by any stretch of the imagination. 470 pages, lots of over 140,000 words. But thankfully, a lot of the concepts really haven't changed. If you want to go to the second slide or the next slide, Stuart. There are a couple different sections to the proposed or the final rule. The big thing is really you want to start at the rule itself. That's on page 384. If you get the plain text version, I was not smart enough to grab the page number for the rule. Or actually, it's there. It's 83,214. That page is the page you want to go to where you actually see the rule itself. The stuff before it, the responses to the comments, the regulatory necessities, and other pieces of that, they're really helpful. They can be beneficial, but they're not authoritative at the end of the day. They help courts understand how to interpret things. They help us all understand how to interpret things, but they're not really required reading. So if you want to understand the CMMC requirements, really the best place to start is all the way down on page 384, which means you only get about 100 pages of reading, which isn't so bad. Stuart, if you want to go to the next slide, please. And as I said, the information up front is very beneficial. If you want to click on the next couple, Stuart, as well. Sorry, I made you do a lot of extra work. That background information, again, very helpful. If you're not that familiar with CMMC, it can be useful to read through it all. But a lot of it, you get bogged down into geeky people like me who submitted comments to DoD and then DoD's responses to the geeky people. And so it's a lot of weird things that if you're not that familiar with it, just skip ahead. It really does make life a whole lot easier. You can go to the next slide, please.
Right.
Thank
So,
you.
sorry, Stuart.
No, I was just going to say that certainly the 32 CFR Part 170 is not the only rule that is in process or not the only thing that needs to be finalized before CMMC can find its way into contracts. Can you tell us a little bit about what else is required, what else is going on?
All right, there's a lot going on in the regulatory space right now because, Stuart, as you mentioned, there's two sets of rules, I should say, that need to be implemented for the CMMC program to be fully implemented. What we got this week was that programmatic rule that's in CFR Part 32 that lays out the entire program in gruesome detail, like the Odyssey or the Iliad. in length. And it really provides an excellent background of what contractors should expect. But without something to put this into contracts, contractors don't have anything they have to do. So under Title 48 of the CFR, those are the DFARS rules that will be found in contracts and connect with the programmatic rule that just came out. Now, those Title 48 rules will be a lot shorter than what we've gotten, because they're essentially just a shorter DFARS clause that's going to go into the contracts and say which level is applicable, when it's applicable, but that's the mechanism that DoD will use to enforce it on the supply chain. They don't have that mechanism yet. So that will be something worth watching. We expect that towards the end of Q1 2025, just coming up. And that's when the program will officially completely roll out. But besides that, we've had the 7012 clause, which I mentioned a little while ago, that's been around for some time. It requires, among other things, compliance with NIST 800-171. It talks about what controlled unclassified information is in the context of contracts. Requires an incident notification response within 72 hours, among other things. They are updating this clause currently, and we don't know exactly what that update will look like or what it will address, but just from reading the tea leaves and talking to folks within the Department of Defense and seeing what's on documents that they've released, we expect that we'll see an update to the controlled unclassified information definition. Right now, it's a little bit murky in the rule itself. I think we'll see NIST 800-172 as an additional standard as part of this rule, because the CMMC program is going to use certain controls from NIST 800-172. And also just they'll clarify how this clause will work with CMMC. The DoD has said this clause is not going anywhere. It's going to remain as a clause that has requirements in it, because there are additional requirements that CMMC doesn't have, such as incident notifications that are in this rule. So we'll be seeing this probably sometime next year, the proposed adjustments to this DFARS rule. And then there's also the last thing is a new assessment methodology rule in the DFARS that's expected to happen late this year, early next year, that will have the methodology for 800-171 assessments going forward. So a lot of rulemaking activity going on, but the road is very clear about CMMC, that it's happening, and it's happening pretty soon. Stuart, back to you.
Very good. Eric, thanks. So let's talk a little bit about the specifics and the requirements. So when the CMMC 2.0 program, it was first announced in November of 2021, it changed the 5-level structure that was in the original CMMC 1.0 to a 3-level structure. And that 3-level structure is what appears in the final rule. CMMC has also evolved from establishing its own set of derived requirements in 2020 to relying on existing frameworks and requirements. So kind of getting into the specifics, CMMC Level 1 is foundational, and it applies to contractors that only handle federal contract information, or FCI. A change in the final rule changes the requirements for Level 1 from 17 controls that exist within the NIST 800-171 framework to the prevailing FAR 52.204-1 requirements that already apply to all federal contracts. And this is really just a change in reference, as the 15 FAR 52.204-1 requirements map directly to those 17 NIST 800-171 controls. And otherwise put, the actual requirements an organization needs to meet for Level 1, those have not changed. CMMC Level 2 is advanced, and this applies to contractors that handle controlled unclassified information, or CUI. Now, a revision to NIST 800-171, Revision 3, was released in May of this year, and a great deal is going to need to happen for Revision 3 to go into effect. And the final rule specifically calls out NIST 800-171 Revision 2, the one that we're familiar with, which has 110 controls. This is what's going to be in effect, and that's what must be satisfied. The rule also states that a CMMC Level 2 certification satisfies the Level 1 requirements, but this is as long as the scope is the same. And this may not always be the case, because in some organizations, they will need to certify their FCI and their CUI boundaries separately. Some organizations simply just have FCI and a broader part of their organization, more people, different IT systems. And if that's the case, those two environments are going to need to be assessed separately, one at level 1, one at level 2. CMMC level 3 is only going to affect a very small number of contractors that handle highly sensitive CUI on critical DoD programs. And in addition to the 110 NIST 800-171 controls, level 3 includes 24 specific controls in the NIST 800-172 framework that Eric referred to. One thing to remember is that organizations are required to flow down the requirements in DFARS 250, 204, 7012 to their subcontractors with whom they exchange CUI. As Eric indicated, it's not just the direct contractors of the DoD, but it's their subcontractors, subcontractors to the lowest level at which CUI is exchanged. And finally, the level requirement for a given contract is going to appear in the solicitation document and will also appear in the contract requirements. So those that need to achieve only level 1 must perform an annual self-assessment, and then the result of that self-assessment is entered into the Supplier Performance Risk System, or SPRS. At level 2, 5% of organizations that handle CUI will only be required to complete a self-assessment annually and submit the results into SPRS. The remaining 95% of organizations that handle CUI will have to undergo an independent third-party assessment that will be conducted by an authorized CMMC third-party assessment organization, or a C3PAO, and this needs to occur every 3 years. The results of these assessments are submitted into EMAS, but an annual self-assessment is also necessary. Again, the solicitation and the contract requirements will specify whether a self-assessment or a C3PAO assessment is going to be required. And the few organizations that must achieve level 3 will first complete and pass a CMMC level 2 assessment conducted by a C3PAO. The and pass part is important. And then the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, or commonly referred to as DIBCAC, which is part of the Defense Contract Management Agency, will perform the assessment of the 24 NIST 800-172 controls. And again, these results are submitted into EMAS. So on this slide, the first point to make here is that certification is a condition of award. Now, I'll explain what certification means in a moment. But the important point is that you don't need to be certified to bid, but don't be surprised if primes are looking for subcontractors that are already satisfied when preparing their bid, because it really is a way of reducing the risk to them to be assured that those subcontractors, in fact, will be ready at the time of award. And those that were hoping certification would occur anytime before the contract actually started, you're out of luck. You must be certified at the time of award. In the final rule, there have been changes to the allowance of plans of action and milestones, or POAMs. And actually, these changes have made the requirements more liberal than they originally appeared to be. For level 1, no POAMs are allowed. All 15 FAR 52, 204, 21 requirements must be scored as met. In the December 2023 proposed rule, POAMs were only allowed for level 2 and only during the first 2 phases of the program's rollout, which then would have been from month 1 through month 12. In the final rule, an organization can achieve a conditional certification if a minimum assessment score of 80% is achieved, including all mandatory requirements, and that POAMs exist or created for all of the not met items. And the conditional certification is sufficient to receive an award, but all POAM items must be remediated and must be reassessed as met within 180 days. The conditional assessment then becomes a final, the conditional certification then becomes a final certification. But if the POAM items are not successfully remediated within the 180 days, the conditional assessment is rescinded and the OSC will need to start the process from the very beginning. And One other note, if an organization's boundary scope changes, which could happen in the case of an acquisition or a significant new system, for example, a new assessment and certification is going to be required according to the final rule. The last key change in CMMC that carries through to the final rule is the need for a senior official of the organization to file an affirmation as to the accuracy of the information that has been submitted into SPRS and EMAS. And the affirmation occurs after results have been submitted, and in the case of an organization receiving a conditional certification after POAM closeout. Level 2 organizations need to submit an affirmation annually, even though their C3PAO assessment occurs triennially. So this is what necessitates an annual self-assessment for those organizations. The final rule provides a definition of an affirming official. It helps clarify this and defines them as someone who, quote, is responsible for ensuring the company's compliance with the CMMC program requirements and who has the authority to affirm the company's continuing compliance with the specified security requirements for their respective organization. And as noted on the slide, this certainly creates liability for the affirming official under the False Claims Act. So if any of you are an affirming official and don't look good in an orange jumpsuit, take this responsibility very seriously because the DoD is. So let me hand this back to Eric to talk about the timeline for rollout of the CMMC program.
Sure. Thanks, Stuart. And excellent points there, of course. So the CMMC program itself is here, even though it's not in contracts yet. These CMMC assessments can start with C3POs, certified third-party assessment organizations, in December. So we're just around the corner from actually having official assessments. They'll be available in advance of the rule. There are just under 60 companies capable of doing these assessments, although some of them have multiple assessment teams. There will probably be a large number of companies seeking an assessment sooner rather than later. So my advice to folks is generally, get scheduled with a C3PO now if you're technically ready to get there, because they may become a kind of a vanishing commodity as time goes on, as this program rolls out. The contractual requirements will probably begin late first quarter, around March 2025. The comments for the DFARS rule closed earlier this week. And if passed as any prologue, they're going to move very quickly here. They move this final rule very quickly, especially considering its length. The DFARS rule is much shorter and much simpler to implement in general. So I imagine they'll dispense with the comments very quickly and move to get these changes over to OMB as fast as possible, so OMB can review them and approve them. When the DFARS rule is released, we're going to have a 4-phase rollout, beginning when the effective date of the rule is. And let's go to the next slide, Stuart, and we could look at that rollout. This changed a little bit from the proposed rule, where between phase 1 and stage 2, we had a 6-month window, or 6 months of time. In the proposed rule, they pushed it out another 6 months to do a year. You could see this is I like kind of putting dates to timelines because the timelines are a little dense in the rule itself. This assumes these are not actual dates, as it says it's estimated timing. This assumes a March 1st, 2025 effective date. It could be sooner, it could be after that, but let's pick March 1st as the effective date. On the effective date of the rule, level 1 and level 2 self-assessments will be required as a condition of award if the CMMC clause is in your contract. And that means, right now, contractors are required to report in the supplier performance risk system how many of the controls they're compliant with. You could be compliant with 0 controls and still technically get a contract award. There's no requirement under that to not get a contract award, although I would argue there's maybe a risk there based on the 7012 clause. But put that aside, the level 1 and level 2 self-assessments will require a certain amount of controls to be in place in order to have a successful assessment, even though it's a self-assessment. And they have the option of moving those self-assessments back towards an option period, or moving up the C3PAO conditional and final certifications required as a condition of award, because that stage 2, starts March 1st, 2026, estimated, of course, where in all new contracts, a C3PO final certification or conditional certification will be required as a condition of award. So that timeline may skew earlier for certain programs, and that's all the way down the supply chain. Or again, they have the option of pushing it back to an option year. The key is we just don't know for each program when the CMMC will roll out. And this may create a little bit of a rush in the bank because for some folks, they're not willing to take a chance that CMMC may come earlier than advertised. So they will, kind of rush forward to get a certification, or at least a conditional certification, so they can be ready when the CMMC clause rolls out. You can see for stage 3, the level 3 DIPCAC assessment, final certification or conditional certification will be required as a condition of award. Also, a level 2 conditional final certification for all option periods of previously awarded contracts. And these are for contracts that were awarded after the effective date of the CMMC DFARS rule between that time and March 1st, 2027, or whenever that effective date is for this stage, for this phase. And then for stage 4, which is presumably March 1st, 2028, or thereabouts, all contracts and options will be applicable for CMMC, and we'll have all the CMMC requirements in it. It's really interesting where you look at the stage 3, and it only relates back to the requirement only attaches if you have a new contract that's after the effective date of stage 1, but stage 4 doesn't have such kind of timeline. There's not language in there, and I'm not sure if this was on purpose or they just weren't being very precise, but there's no language kind of limiting the relate back. So it's possible DoD could interpret stage 4 as being as counting on existing contracts that maybe are effective right now as we speak, that may at the option have CMMC inserted into it. So we'll see if there's further clarity from DoD, but that language is a little bit different for stage 3 and stage 4, which I think is interesting. Next slide.
Yeah, and Eric, just let me ask, doesn't the rule also specify approximately how many contracts or how many assessments, I'm sorry, will be affected each year?
Right, and they estimate in the first year somewhere between 300 and 400 assessments will take place. I would be surprised if the number is that low, but that indicates to me that they see some contracts having CMMC earlier, because within the first year, there's no assessment that's required right now, because that stage happens March 1st, 2026. So it's clear that they think that some contractors will get assessed because there's of a contractual requirement, but then that number ramps up significantly over time, where you're talking about 10,000, 15,000 contractors a year needing an assessment.
Right.
Great point and great question. So kind of the last thing on this rollout, I think that's important to know, is that the CMMC program, as I indicated in the last slide, could come out sooner for some contractors. First, there are prime contractors out there that may require their subcontractors to be compliant sooner because they don't know exactly when compliance will be required for them. So they're going to pass this uncertainty down their supply chain. There just may be some prime contractors unwilling to take the risk of a cybersecurity incident if their subcontractors are handling controlled unclassified information. Also, DoD noted, as I indicated too, in the rulemaking, that it may require CMMC compliance a little bit earlier than actually required in a rule. And this is a quote we pulled just from the rule. The department, meaning DoD, may include CMMC level 2 certification requirements on contracts awarded prior to the CMMC DFARS coverage becoming effective, but doing so will require a bilateral contract modification after negotiations, meaning if you are subject to this updated requirement before the rulemaking comes out, you'll have the ability to kind of negotiate a price increase if you need to reflect the additional costs that you have because you're getting a CMMC requirement that's early. But DoD reserves the right to do that even before the DFARS rule if the parties agree. Stuart, back to you.
Very good. And I think they also stipulates that even in phase 1, in a regular contract, they can stipulate that they want a C3PAO assessment, even though phase 1 would, right. So there are some exceptions that are listed in the rule. So
right.
And a number of other things are addressed. I'm sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. I was going to say the optional column in the chart from the last slide, I think, lists a lot of those. So if folks are interested where the different ways that DoD can go, and they have a lot of optionality within the rule, a lot of flexibility. So things could come sooner or later. We don't know until it happens.
Right. That's a good point. And there is a lot of content in these slides. And if we didn't mention it, we will be sending an email to everybody who's attending the webinar with a link to be able to download the slides, as well as a link to the replay of this webinar. So other considerations that we find in the rule, including such things as scoping. And Jim, I know you have a number of things that you want to walk us through here.
Sure. So if you're not familiar with the idea of scoping, it's basically what's inbounds and out of bounds for the assessment, right? So which pieces of your environment are the assessment team actually able to, or is the assessment team actually able to look at, and which things are just not part of the assessment. And they've actually refined this in a couple interesting ways in the final rule. So for level 1, if you're only handling that federal contract information, anything that touches the federal contract information is in scope. If it doesn't touch it, basically, if it doesn't store, process, or transmit that information, then it's out of scope. Makes things really easy for most organizations. It means you can have most small businesses have a relatively flat network environment. For example, everybody's just kind of on one network segment. And for those organizations, they don't have to re-architect and move things around and everything. It's just basically whatever touches the FCI is in scope, and otherwise it's out. So makes things really easy for you. When it gets to controlled and classified information, things get a little bit more interesting. So thankfully, the IoT, the industrial IoT, government furnished equipment, and the operational technology things are in scope. That is, they have to be, they're on the same network. There's a recognition that they're there and can have some security implications, but they're actually not assessed. So that makes life a little bit easier for everybody. You do have to make sure that you list all of them. There's some basic requirements in there, but overall, from a security perspective, life gets a little bit easier. Otherwise, if it processes, stores, or transmits CUI, or if it secures the environment, then it's in scope for the assessment. And that raises a question of, sometimes I've got pieces of equipment that are on my network that we've got a policy that, even though it sits on the network, same network as the stuff that's handling CUI, we've policies that say don't put any CUI here. The assessment teams will still get to look at those policies. They'll still get to look at how you're implementing everything. And as long as those policies pass the smell test, then you'll be okay. And the assessment teams won't dig into exactly what you're doing on that equipment. But otherwise, if your policies just seem unreasonable, then the assessment team is going to dig in, and you can be ready for them to actually assess that equipment against the full requirements in 800.171. So there's a lot of subtleties here. There's a lot of things that you can do from an architectural perspective that would make things a little bit easier. I'll talk about those in just a second. When you get up to level 3, and there's only about 3,000 companies that are expected to need level 3 certifications, but when you get up to level 3, basically it's anything. If it could, not just does, but even if it could store, process, transmit, or secure the CUI, it's in scope. So they've really kind of taken this nice gradual approach, and again, made things a little bit more fair for most organizations. Stuart, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So to put that a little more simply, basically, if you want to exclude an asset from being part of your assessment, then don't give it access to controlled, unclassified, or federal contract information, right? So, and especially when it comes to CUI, you want to isolate the CUI to specific rooms or specific buildings, and you want locks on the door so not anybody can walk in. Only people that have been assigned keys can get into the rooms. Same thing from a network perspective. You're putting all your CUI basically in one network environment, and you're keeping everybody else out of that network. And same thing for the people. And this is actually a fundamental part of the CUI program. There's this concept called lawful government purpose, and only people with a lawful government purpose to have access to that information should have access to it. So you'll want to stop and really think through the overall architecture and isolate things to the greatest extent possible. As I said, it's not necessarily required at the FCI level, but it's a good business practice, and it's a smart thing, especially if your organization is going to grow and do other work for DoD later. Probably smart to start thinking about how to change some of the architecture at this point. Stuart, if you want to go to the next slide. And one of the easiest ways to do that, and this doesn't work for every organization, but one of the easiest ways to do that is to use what's called virtual desktops. And in the final rule, they've actually said that it's okay to use a virtual desktop. If you're not familiar with them, it's basically a computer that's running up in the cloud, and you can take remote control of that computer, and everything stays up in that cloud environment. So if you're using the FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent environment, you've implemented your remote desktop up there, and you can access that remote desktop from anywhere. As long as your remote desktop client, the thing that you're actually using on your computer, does not do anything other than stream the keyboard, video, and mouse, that is, you can't copy and paste, you can't print, you can't do anything locally, then you're good. And that end client, that end device, the thing that you're using, doesn't even fall into scope. So it makes things a whole lot easier. Not so much in the manufacturing environment necessarily, where you're still going to have to bring your G code down. You're still going to have to do other things that where you're bringing that CUI into certain parts of your building. But for other parts of the environment, your engineering teams, et cetera, you could actually isolate things and make your life a whole lot easier. So the virtual desktops are a great way to go. And it's nice to see DoD actually embracing this and taking that risk-based approach to figuring out that, okay, yeah, people might take pictures with their phones and they might do some other things, but from an overall risk perspective, if we can get them to use VDI, it's going to make life a whole lot better. If you want to go to the next slide, please, Stuart. So then the bigger question that everybody always asks is, what is FCI and what is CUI? So FCI is basically any non-public government information that's unclassified information. So it's pretty much anything, emails with the government, any communications back and forth, anything is FCI. CUI is a subset of that. And CUI is information that's created for on behalf of the government, or possessed for on behalf of the government, that is non-public and unclassified. And most importantly, that there is a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that says that the information can or must be either safeguarded or is subject to some kind of dissemination controls, meaning you can't just give it to anybody. So either we've said it needs to be secured, or we've said it can't be shared with other people, not with anybody. And so that's what makes it CUI. Everybody kind of gets wrapped around the axle with the definition of CUI, and it's really not that hard when you take the time and actually read through the requirements, or read through the definition. And Stuart, if you want to go to the next slide. So who decides when information is CUI? Put most bluntly, not you. For most of the folks on the call, it's the government. So the government has to decide that the information, if you read the 32 CFR 2002, it talks about how the agency makes the determination that the information is CUI, not you, the end contractor. The government tells you that this information is CUI. It does that in one of two ways. It either gives you a document that's marked as CUI, where it's really overt that, hey, this information is CUI, or they ask you to create something, and in the contract, they should tell you, hey, this thing that we're about to ask you to create, that's CUI. And when you create it, you need to mark it. And here's how to mark it. There's a whole bunch of subtleties to this that, in the interest of time, we won't go through all of them today, but there's it's not that hard. And the best single best piece of advice is go back and ask your prime, ask the government, is this CUI? If you have a question, you don't have the authority to just slap a CUI label on something and make that determination yourself. You've got to ask. So just review everything, make sure you're meeting whatever the government tells you to do, make sure you are meeting those requirements. It's a good general rule of thumb. You want to go to the next slide, please. Is your information CUI is also a question that everybody asks, and I think I've actually seen it come up in the chat today, or in the Q&A today. And the short answer is no. Your information is not created for the government, so therefore it is not controlled and classified information. It literally does not meet the definition of CUI, at least while it's in your environment. If you share that information with the government, it might turn into CUI when the government is handling it, because we do want, like, if you give them your sensitive information, if I gave them my bank account information, I would kind of want them to treat that carefully and put appropriate protections in place. Same idea applies here, right? You really want to make sure that it is properly protected, and the government is properly protecting the information. If the government gives me back my bank account information, does that mean that I suddenly have CUI in my environment? No. But if the government gave me Eric's information because I was working under a contract with them, or Stuart's bank account information, then it is CUI because it's not mine, it's somebody else's, and they gave it to the government expecting it to be protected, and I've got to protect it too. Stuart, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So now we get into the funky area of security protection data. So we know that our information is not CUI. We know the government's information can be when they tell us that it is. Now there's this thing called security protection data. We talked a minute ago about how the 800.171 and CMMC apply to the any systems that store, process, or transmit CUI, as well as the systems that are used to secure it. Security protection data is information about how you're securing that information. That information, the security protection information, is your information. It inherently cannot be controlled, unclassified information in your environment. Again, if you share it with the government, that's another story. However, DoD in the final rule has said that because of language in 800.171, they require that security protection data be protected as though it is controlled, unclassified information. So they are not trying to make security protection data a form of CUI, but they're saying that basically, if we're going to trust you with our sensitive stuff, we want to make sure that not only are you protecting our sensitive stuff, but that you're also protecting the information that talks about how you're protecting our sensitive stuff. So there's some subtleties in here. There's some interesting twists and turns in here, but from a CUI perspective, it technically isn't CUI, but it is subject to many of the same safeguarding requirements that are in place for CUI. I'm going to go to the next slide, please.
Right. Before we move on, just to mention that if anybody has questions about CUI, feel free to ask Jim. He's literally written the book. Actually, I think it's 3 books on CUI, if I'm not mistaken. So,
yes, sir. Thank you.
So one of the areas the final rule talks about is external service providers, and it talks about requirements for external service providers, and it doesn't talk about requirements for external service providers, as we're going to see. And for those that aren't familiar with the term, an external service provider is generally it's a third party outside an organization that provides services to that organization. And there are primarily 3 types that we'll find within the scope of CMMC. A cloud service provider, or more appropriately, a cloud service, is a computing resource, such as a storage or as a business application or infrastructure that is hosted by a third-party provider and made available to users over the internet. A lot of software, such as ERP software, is provided as a cloud service. Programs like Salesforce for CRM are cloud services. Managed service providers typically manage an organization's IT infrastructure, and they provide services such as technical support to end users, system maintenance, and network monitoring. And managed security service providers, MSSPs, deliver services that are focused on managing IT security, and they perform functions such as log analysis and incident response. Again, the list becomes a lot longer. Different MSPs set of services differ from others, so that each one kind of has a specific catalog of the services they provide. But you can think of MSPs as basically making sure your data is always available to internal users and to customers, while MSSPs, their responsibility is to make sure the data is only available to authorized internal users and customers. And we talk about ESPs because they're important for a number of reasons. And the primary one is that they reduce the burden on your organization to achieve and maintain compliance. And they do this by assuming full or partial responsibility for certain objectives. In essence, you inherit those controls that are assumed by an external service provider on your behalf. External service providers will also bring expertise and specialized resources that may be required and often on a shared services basis. Incident responders, for example, are somebody like the fire department you hope you never need, but if you do need one, it's generally available through an MSP or an MSSP on a shared services basis. You're kind of paying for what you need. And finally, we'll find that external service providers are going to bring best practices. They'll help you understand what you need to do to satisfy certain practices, procedures that you may need, and they'll bring proven solutions. So kind of the net of it is that using an external service provider can reduce the cost, it can reduce the time, and it can reduce the risk that's generally associated with not only achieving CMMC certification, but ensuring that you're maintaining compliance with the requirements over time. So the final rule does establish requirements for external service providers. And most notably, let's start, if you use a cloud service to process, store, or transmit CUI, then that cloud service must satisfy the requirements of the FedRAMP moderate baseline. What does that mean? Well, FedRAMP is a government program that provides a standardized approach to ensure that the cloud services used by federal agencies meet a minimum security threshold based on the sensitivity of information that those systems typically hold. And achieving a FedRAMP authority to operate, or an ATO, from a federal agency, or being able to establish that the FedRAMP requirements have been met without an ATO, it's not an easy matter. And the prevailing requirements for demonstrating equivalency that were published by the DoD CIO back in December, they're pretty challenging. The DoD has set a very high bar for FedRAMP moderate equivalency without having gone through the process and received an authority to operate. And as an organization that needs to become CMMC certified, it's your responsibility to be able to provide the documentation to an assessor that the cloud services you use meet that standard. And many commercial applications today do not. And so again, an important responsibility to make sure that the cloud services you're using are able to achieve this. In the case of an MSP or an MSSP, or a cloud service that doesn't handle CUI, the services they provide are in scope for your assessment. Those services are going to be assessed as part of your assessment. And so, for example, if a managed service provider provides patching services, they will participate in your assessment and they will address how they satisfy the related controls. They will show their SSP and so forth. There's one requirement, though, for ESPs that appeared in the proposed rule that was dropped from the final rule. And the proposed rule back in December required MSPs and MSSPs to be certified at a minimum at the same level as their clients, requiring that they demonstrate a minimum level of kind of competence and understanding of the requirements. If they themselves have been able to satisfy those requirements, if they themselves have passed a certification assessment, an indication that they have an understanding and have a basic capability to be able to support and help their clients. And specifically, back in the proposed rule, it stated that if an OSA, an organization seeking assessment, utilizes an external service provider other than a cloud service provider, the ESP must have a CMMC level or 2 final certification assessment. And this final rule, moreover, the final rule, however, has no certification requirement for MSPs or MSSPs. And this, for many of us is a big concern. And what it means to you is, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Not everyone that claims that they are capable of helping you achieve and maintain CMMC conformance as an MSP or an MSSP, and as well as some that say they have FedRAMP moderate equivalency as a cloud service, simply may not. I just can relate a story of a C3PAO that recently told me they had completed a JSVA for a company that was using a commercial managed service provider. The company thought that they would pass the JSVA. That's why they went and applied for it. And instead, when they were scored, they scored a minus 155. That's a pretty bad score. The scale goes from minus 203 to 155. And so I think the point is that you need to be careful who you listen to. You really need to focus on trusted resources when looking at external service providers. So Jim, let me pass this on to you to talk about assessments in the 10 or so minutes we've got left.
Sure. So fundamentally, to Stuart's point, the assessments are, you want to make sure that you're taking the time and really getting your ducks in a row. Obviously, a tool like FutureFeed would be a wonderful tool to help with that. We actually helped one of our clients get through a C3PAO assessment. So they wanted to become a C3PO in about 8 hours. So that makes life a whole lot easier. But big picture, the assessment process is not that bad. The assessment teams are not walking in expecting to rip open every drawer, hunting for CUI that you mishandled or anything like that. They're really looking at a high level. This is about validation of your cybersecurity program. So they're walking in and doing what's called examine, interview, and test. We're going to look at your documentation, make sure that everything looks like it meets all of the basic requirements. If you've got problems in your documentation, then obviously we're not going to continue on. So that's the first step. Make sure everything looks right. And then we're going to sit down with your team. We're going to interview your team members, generally the people that are responsible or accountable for making sure that the compliance requirements are in place. And then the last piece is we're going to test. We're just going to validate that everything that you've told us you were doing through your documentation, everything that we've heard you say you were doing in the interview, and the things that you've actually done are all consistent. If everything matches up, then great, we're going to move on. It's only when there's inconsistencies that the assessment teams start to have issues, or when you're fundamentally, if what you've said is just way off the mark and you start getting really negative scores, that's when things start to go awry. But the assessment teams are not there. Trust me, we're not trying to like beat everybody up as soon as we walk through the door. It is not meant to be an overly aggressive or antagonistic relationship. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one thing that DoD did do in the final rule is to change some of the requirements. So the nonprofit that I run published an analysis of some of the costs and other things for CMMC assessments, and some of it was based on certain staffing models and everything. DoD has now said that the assessment team requires at least 2 people, which is not that much of a change, really. But then they've also added this other person, this QA person, who has to do the review. And some of that is a subtle change because that QA person cannot be a member of the assessment team. So they've added sort of a third person in there, which does make the assessments more expensive because you're just paying for 3 people, 3 bodies. Thankfully, I don't think that it throws the pricing off too much, but it's still it is going to increase the cost of that assessment. Can we go to the next slide, please, Stuart? So talk about what the time and cost. So the joint surveillance voluntary assessments are typically done in about 200 assessor hours. That is, they've got a team of people. They split up the work among everybody, and then again, it takes about 200 hours. That QA is going to add additional time. The billing rates for most of those people are generally in the $200 to $300 an hour. So you can assume rough order of magnitude for the cost of an assessment. We're looking at about $50,000 to $60,000 for a simple assessment. When we start getting travel time, people having to come on site and do things, you have complex environments, blah, 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 then the price is going to go up, obviously. But for a small business, this is kind of rough order of magnitude what you can expect. There are some things, so the 3 of us actually did a session not that long ago with a C3PAO who made the point that if you have all your ducks in a row and the C3PAO can see that you are organized and that it looks like most of the stuff is ready to go, they might actually cut you a break on that. And we've actually seen at FutureFeed, one of our clients told us that they got a discount for their assessment because they saw that everything was done and they knew it was going to go quicker. So there are some things that you can do. There are some ways of shaving some of those costs off. But from a budget perspective, if you're trying to just figure out rough order of magnitude, what is this going to cost? There's an answer for you. Is probably in that $50,000 to $60,000 range. If you want to go to the next slide, please. And a couple of key concepts. We've talked a little bit about some of these already. Plans of action and milestones are one of the big ones. They are now allowed, and they actually have been allowed since the proposed rule. It used to be that you had to have everything done right under CMMC. You had to have all 110 requirements done. Now you can actually get an 80% as long as most of the requirements are in place and that you meet certain specific ones, then you're in good shape. and you can actually get what's called the certification, or of course I'm going to flub the name of the assessment type now, but there's this basically a conditional assessment or conditional certification. You have 180 days to close everything out, and then you get your certification. As long as you close everything out in that 180 days, you're in good shape. If you don't, you're in trouble. So I would not be counting on those. The goal should be, when you're walking into the assessment, have everything done and really be ready to go, not be thinking that you've got a like 90 or 100 point score and that you're just going to finish up the rest later. You really want to make sure you have all your ducks in a row up front. There's other things now too. DoD has added these things called operational plans of action and enduring exceptions, where they recognize that sometimes environments change. You have, for example, a piece of medical equipment or test equipment that can't be touched for a variety of reasons, FDA or for other reasons. So those things have vulnerabilities. They have known vulnerabilities in them, and you literally can't change them. What do you do? How do you handle those? Well, that's considered an enduring exception now, and they're actually allowed in the assessment. So you're okay there. You need to document them. There's a bunch of other hoops you need to jump through, but there is some wiggle room. The operational plans of action is sort of analogous to that, where you may have a device. There's what's called a critical vulnerability, a CVE. People say, oh, there's some kind of problem with that device, and you need to apply a patch, but there's no patch available for it. You don't have a fix for the problem, or the patch throws you out of compliance with some other requirement. Now you can create an operational plan of action where you're actually tracking everything and able to monitor what's going on in the environment, and they don't count against your compliance score. That last one is the affirmations that Stuart talked about. Those are really critical. Make sure that you're aware, make sure your senior management is aware that they are going to have to be doing these affirmations. You're starting to put personal responsibility and personal liability on some of these folks, and that creates an interesting wrinkle in everything. So you want to make sure your teams are ready. Stuart, if you want to move on.
I was going to say, if you can wrap this up in about 30 seconds, Jim.
Yes, sir. So big thing is have your documentation in order. Minimize repetition. We really don't want to have multiple copies of the same information multiple places, because you get into version control issues. And make sure you're collecting evidence as much as you can. You want to prove, I mentioned before about having policies and procedures and how that you can rely on those. But if you can't prove that the policies and procedures are actually being followed, the assessment team is not really going to trust you. So with that, I will wrap up.
Very good. Well, I think we've just hit the hour. We will provide written responses to all the questions that people have provided. One point I want to emphasize is don't hesitate to ask for help. There's a lot to understand. Please consider the three of us as individual resources. On the very last slide, which you'll have access to, you'll find our email addresses. Connect with us on LinkedIn, but we're certainly here to help. We each have a personal commitment to the success of this program. Again, the last point I want to make is, don't think of this as a compliance thing. Think of CMMC as about something that's going to enable all of us to sleep more soundly at night. There's a reason, as Eric told us, this program is being put into place. The theft of information by our adversaries has really diminished our technological superiority and advantage. This is a means of really being able to reestablish, recapture our technological advantage and the superiority of our national defense, again, so that we can all sleep well at night. We all have a responsibility to protect the sensitive information with which the government entrusts us and that we create on behalf of the work that we do for the government. And I urge you to think in those terms. On behalf of the three of us, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, we plan on redoing this in a couple of weeks with some updated information as this evolves a little bit more. So look for some information on that. We will be sending out a link to the slides, to a replay of this webinar, as well as answers to the questions. And do feel free to reach out to any of the three of us with any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.